KoitCast. Today's guest has been investigating and researching UFOs and other paranormal phenomena since 1967. He has written a number of books on the paranormal and is also the editor of Alternate Perceptions magazine. A big Koit welcome to Brent Raynes. Hi Brent, welcome to KoitCast.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate you reaching out to me and offering me this opportunity to speak to your audience. Thank you.
Excellent, well, thank you. You come well recommended, so I'm looking forward to this one a lot. Let's start with, in your own words, I suppose, who are you, where are you from?
Well, United States of America. I'm originally from the state of Maine. That's where I was born and grew up. Then years later, I married a young lady from here in Tennessee, Waynesboro, Tennessee, and been here since 1977.
Excellent
And
stuff.
so, this is something on UFOs. I got interested at a very young age. I kind of jumped ahead there, but age 14, January 1967. A few months earlier, I had read a book that back at that time kind of inspired a number of people to enter the field. Flying Saucer Serious Business by Frank Edwards, and it was basically. The approach was a mainstream UFO ET nuts and bolts. It took a little while later before I became interested in some of the what Hynek called later the high strange type scenarios. But anyway, that was my early beginning. I'd always been kind of interested in the possibility of life in space. I know in 1966 there was a huge uptick worldwide in UFO sightings, and it was making a lot of news, or at least it appeared to be an uptick. But I know in March of 1966, I was, as I say, born and raised in the state of Maine, and although Michigan was getting a lot of the reports, college students at a university seeing some lights, and then some other people. It was in the state of Maine and Bangor that we had a gentleman in March of 66 who claimed that he had seen a domed metallic looking disc or oblong type craft, maybe 40 feet diameter, and it was moving very low over the ground. In fact, there were bushes that were rubbing the underside of it. And what made it sensational was he had a handgun and he fired at it. He said he heard a ping.
Nice.
And the police there in Bangor, he went to them and reported what happened, and they said he seemed genuinely, frightened, disturbed by what ever the experience was, and so they took it seriously. And I know my father and I would, be kind of watching the skies, but we never did see anything ourselves. But
So
anyway,
you had interest from an early age, but you didn't have
so
any
I
experiences, is that right?
Right, that's right. I just started out nothing at least at that time that I connected as an experience, but certainly I was interested as a young boy in dinosaurs and watching sci-fi flicks, and possibility of outer space. And we had a place in Andover, Maine, that my father, I know at least, uh, took me and my mom up there a couple of times, where they had what they called the big ear that was listening to noises from space. And my dad would ask him, "You ever pick up any that could be maybe communications from another planet?" And of course, I was quite excited of the possibility. He said, "No, not yet. Some peculiar sounds, but I think they were pulsars and things like that created static and noise that
Sure,
really
sure.
wasn't an intelligent signal they could identify, or at least it told us." But
That
that was
that
how it
past that
began.
you said there about boys with dinosaurs and then into sci-fi, that is the exact route I've taken, and no doubt many many other people have taken that same route.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. I got a friend, Martin Powell, down here about 42 miles from where I live, in in Florence, Alabama. I'm close to the Florence line, Alabama line, and he's a science fiction writer, and that's how he makes his living. But at an early age, he was interested in sci-fi, and he recalls a time when he was about 9 years old up in Kentucky. He and some friends saw a craft. And he said it looked just like the one on Lost in Space, the TV series from the
Yeah, yeah.
60s there, the saucer shaped craft, with a window. And anyway, that was his start. Since then, even though it's sci-fi, he's corresponded with people like John Keel and Whitley Strieber and um, Calvin Parker of the Pascagoula fame.
Oh,
And
yes.
in fact, he did a kind of a he contacted Calvin Powell before his passing and got his story and an update on things that have happened since that encounter back in 1973 with the very strange looking aliens. And anyway, he asked me, we became acquainted a couple of years ago to go ahead and write an introduction for the book too that he did. And so it was kind of done like a comic book type thing with illustrations and such that someone else had provided, and he provided the words, and he got them all from Calvin Parker directly. I actually was in the Navy at the time in Mayport, Florida, which is close to Jacksonville, which has an international airport. And so when I found out about the Calvin Parker Hickson case, October 11th, 1973, I jumped on a jet and flew out there to New Orleans. And then a ufologist I found out who'd been in New Orleans provided me transportation over to Pascagoula. And we stopped at the home of Mr. Hickson, and I wanted to get directions. There was a thing on the by the door. This was 10 days after their alleged encounter, and I looked at it, and it talked about they were going to make a big public statement later or something, and their lawyer advised them to you know not to give any more interviews. And so I walked back to the car and I told him, I said, well, this doesn't look good, but I've come this far. I'm not going to I'm not going
Yeah,
to
you can't
stop.
give up.
No. So I knocked on the door and I apologized for disturbing, his peace. I was a grandson, I'm sure, that came to the door, this young boy. And I first met him and I tried to explain, what I was there for. And he opened the door wider and there was Mr. Hickson sitting in a chair nearby. And he said, come on in. And he told me a little. He gave me a copy of a newspaper article that he and Calvin had helped put together about their encounter. He said, this is accurate information about it. Here's a copy, which I still have. And and then he drew me directions to the place where they'd been fishing, where the two of them had been, abducted. So we did that. And of course, the gentleman who provided the transportation, he was quite interested in all of this as well. Being a ufologist who I had seen mentioned one time, along with a picture of him, in Salsa News that Gray Barker and Jim Mosley used to put out years ago, and he was actually a black ufologist, and I didn't really. He was really the first one I'd ever met at that point. I've met other people since then, but anyway, we drove up one of the highways heading toward Jackson, Mississippi afterwards. And I stopped at a police station on the way. And I just had to ask him, since, there was so many reports of UFOs, have you had anybody report a UFO? And said, yes, a trucker came in, truck driver, and he reported a craft that landed along the side of the highway. I said, great. Can I read the report? We didn't write it down. It was just one witness, and he could have been making it up.
Of course.
Yeah, of
Anyone
course.
can, can't they?
Yeah, I thought, gee, usually I've encountered police that at least would put something on a little blotter, and you could follow it up. But that was a dead end there. But anyway, um,
So was
so
that
that
with that like, the Calvin Parker case then? Was that the first time that you physically went out to do looking for things, investigating?
no, I got more involved after I got out of the Navy and active duty in '74. I was still in reserve, but I in '75 I did what I had wanted to do for a long time, and that was get out in the field. As Keel had described, he had back in the '60s had driven through 20 different states, So I wanted to get out there, interview witnesses and experiencers, and sometimes the researchers were actually the experiencers. But that's that wasn't the first time I had gone up into one of the first contactees I ever met was up in Toronto, Canada, back in August of 1971. And that same month, I'd also gotten a letter from Ted Owens, the PK man, who's been quite controversial. And I really thought, oh, this guy just sounds too narcissistic. He's telling me he had some Apache Indian ancestry and he was the best knife thrower in the world, and that's why he's always the best this and that. But as it turned out, he was also someone that investigators like Jeff, the oh my gosh, Jeffrey New Thinking Aloud, but he's a
Mishlove?
psychologist. Mishlove, yes, yes.
Yeah.
I didn't know that would just roll off my tongue. So anyway, when you get 73, your brain just doesn't always.
I get that now at 50. It
Oh,
happens.
but anyway, yeah, I've did an interview with Jeffrey Mishlove over, that Uri Geller as well. Two different interviews, and I've also been on his show talking about Mothman. But I originally just contacted him because I wanted to find out firsthand, and interview him about uh, you know, the PK man. Uh, and I have since found, one of his sons up in Kentucky who recalled for me an incident in California where he claimed that when he was young, his father was there and called down some UFOs. They actually saw a craft, saw beings, and saw some Bigfoots. And I've always been kind of interested in how Bigfoot shows up in some of these cases as well. But uh, they have a lot of testimony from a lot of different people who claim that Ted Owens, the guy who claimed he was the ambassador for the space intelligence, was able to perform, call down UFOs, um, point to a church steeple and say, during a storm, I'm going to direct lightning to strike that steeple. And it was the only place lightning did strike during the storm, and a lot of different testimonies of things that checked out. And one time, Jeff Mishlove said that he was really got startled him was when he got this frantic call from Ted Owens about they don't need to launch this Apollo mission, that there's going to be a tragedy involved. You need to contact NASA and tell them. And he's like, who am I to contact NASA,
Mm.
and let them know. But he said within a month there was a launch, and it was a tragic moment. The ship blew up and everyone on board was killed, just as Ted Owens had warned. And there were a lot of different things like that. He has I think nearly 200 testimonies from a lot of different people claiming that these things that he said came to pass. I've heard a few myself from different people that I know one woman in Ohio said that I had used to visit. She was a contactee and claimed that when he was on the radio, that family members were seeing strange lights inside the house and such. And uh,
A lot of weird stuff going on.
a lot of weird stuff, kind of like Uri Geller. He'd be on the radio and
Yes, and
people would
everyone
start
spoons them
reporting
out in.
this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm interested in your beginning, right? So what drives you to go and drive out to go and see somebody? Is it just because you think, hold on, I really need to know about this, or is it something else?
Well, it just seemed like that was, I was impressed by John Keel and Jacques Billy, that they didn't just take the armchair approach. They actually, went out into the field and, got their hands dirty and investigated these things and tried to make determinations because the accounts, the written accounts, are important. They're valuable, but they only tell you so much. And I know a few years ago I was talking with an Albert Rosales down in Miami, Florida, who is a researcher who a few years ago when I talked with him, he'd accumulated like 17,000 cases worldwide of from various sources, sometimes personal, a lot of times from different publications, books, magazines, Flying Saucer Review, and he would catalog them. And he's written actually quite a number of books covering different time periods. And I said, it's too bad that in those instances, something appears in a newspaper and someone reports, I saw a flying saucer and there was an occupant, that we couldn't go, as you're trying to do with me right now, get to the background, what other things have gone on in your experience. And I know that I met a researcher who was also an experiencer, Ramona Clark, when I was actually in Mayport, Florida. Found out that, I thought she was Jacksonville Beach down a few miles down the road, but she was actually, her husband was in the military, the Navy, and was right on base where my ship was home ported. I mean, how good could it get? We'd corresponded about a year earlier before I went into the Navy. And anyway, her thing was July 1967, the UFO element. She and her husband and 13-year-old son Steve were out riding near Mayport, and they encountered a domed disc-shaped craft about 45 feet in diameter, and it was in front of their car, rocking sort of back and forth like a ship on water. And then it came to a crossroads and it stopped and waited like it was waiting for them to catch up and see which way they were going to go. And they were turning to the left, which was taking them close to the base to at home. And they drove under it and said that her son was in the back seat. He was hanging out the window, and she got kind of frantic, told him to get in because, you never know what kind of radiation might be there, and he said he could see these lights underneath it that they couldn't see from the side, and said that the car headlights started to dim and sort of looked like the beams were retracting into the car. And then the craft moved away toward a nearby Coast Guard station. And then the car seemed to be functioning just perfectly. And she could hear somebody talking over a speaker, but couldn't tell what they were saying. And then two jet interceptors came in, and she figured they came in from Jacksonville Naval Station a few miles away. And anyway, said all of a sudden the disc started glowing like a hot piece of coal, and then shot out over the Atlantic Ocean, and it just left them way behind, and they couldn't catch up with it, the jets. But
Yes.
within about 3 or 4 days after that, her home erupted with poltergeist activity, and footsteps, nobody there, and eventually around 3 o'clock in the morning, she would awaken and there would be a being standing at her bedside. And eventually, she didn't tell anything, she said, to her 13-year-old son, but eventually he started coming in and claiming that beings were appearing in his room as well as a beam of light. And she was also seeing these little balls of light as well. And she would often have a kind of a paralysis associated with the experience. And so anyway, we went on investigation. It was in 73. It was, of course, a lot of sightings, and it was up in Jacksonville, right near the Jacksonville Naval Air Station. And her husband was in the military. He was away at the time, but we'd caught this little story in the police blotter of the Jacksonville newspaper, telling that a woman had reported seeing, and it gave her name and address, luckily, a disc-shaped object with lights around the rim, and 2 nights in a row. So thinking, well, what's that about? So we revisited her, and she seemed quite genuinely shaken, and showed us where she had seen it, and she said it gave her the feeling of being watched. And Ramona, of course, familiar with her own experiences, started asking her, "Well, have you ever had any other unusual experiences in your lifetime?" And at first she said, "No, no, this is the first time." Well, I've never seen a UFO. And then eventually she said, "Well, I did have an experience once where I got a phone call, and it was from a friend who had died months before."
Oh, whoa.
And yeah, and she said, he said he wanted to come see me, and she said, I got scared, and I said, "No, no, don't do that, no, no." It started. I think she was crying, at that point when she said when she was, replying to this voice, and so it ended there. But she'd also seen an apparition one time, and eventually she just kept going through different things. It brought back memories, because she just Ramona just said, other, other experiences you couldn't explain. Didn't say necessarily it was UFO, but and that kind of so that was interesting. And certainly Keel and Valley have found that a lot with people who, and of course there's a question like Gary Nolan of Stanford Research Institute, figuring that maybe some people's are wired a little differently in some way, maybe at some psychic level. Um, and
Do you know what
he
half of this
talked.
suggests, or think I think about is that you almost don't want to see a UFO because it means all this other stuff potentially has happened or will happen to you.
Well, yeah, it seems like a lot of times either the person is already, has some psychic cognitive ability in that direction, um, or maybe the experience of a UFO seems to awaken, you know,
Hmm.
um, the experience within them in some way. Um, but the Nolan had claimed that the caudate putamen in the brain was an area that seemed to have more neural networking wiring in an experiencer than a non-experiencer. And he and Christopher Kit Green, formerly of the CIA, are supposed to come out with some report eventually in a journal, which I would love to see. But
No, me too. Yeah.
you know, of course, Green was actually one of the people. Richard Helms of the director of the CIA, assigned to monitor Stanford Research Institute's study into remote viewing and psychokinesis with Uri Geller and other people who claim to have psychokinetic abilities or clairvoyance, or what they termed remote viewing. Um, and and so that was quite interesting. This I know in my online magazine, Alternate Perceptions, I even wrote about the time that Green was quite skeptical of everything being reported, and skeptical of Uri Geller, and Hal Puthoff was a physicist, laser physicist, had Uri Geller with him in his office at Stanford, and Green was at Langley in Virginia, and offhand, Puthoff says, Uri Geller claims that he can see things remotely at a distance, and reportedly Green's response was, "No, nah, he can't." And so the source I wrote up in my magazine, claimed that you know um, Geller got on the phone and described something in his office that was actually accurate. And so Hal Puthoff, I sent him a copy of the write up because I considered the source was quite reputable. He says, actually wrote back, said, "No, actually, I never allowed Uri Geller to handle the phone. I was the go between. I wanted to make sure, this was done by the book." And so I was the go between Geller and Green. And he said, uh, that did happen. It was, Green was quite surprised by it. And it's one of the things that kind of started to, you know, change Green's opinion of these things. And Green, of course, was a very capable medical doctor. In fact, I think he currently works at a medical hospital up in Michigan. But later on, the story goes that Green is at home and he's got a sealed envelope with different images or targets that he wants Uri Geller to identify. And instead, Uri Geller goes off on something else. He says, um, he describes a scene where a dog in the house has knocked something over, and and Green is completely unaware of what he's talking about. But he describes the dog, he describes the scene, and so he gets up, leaves the phone behind, and walks around the house and discovers exactly what Geller had identified remotely while he was in California. So anyway, then and a few years ago, I met Jacques Vallée at a conference in Virginia Beach, Virginia, the Edgar Cayce's ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment. And I was able to interview him later, and I was real interested in the fact that he had been part of the Stanford Research Institute experience and had seen Uri Geller perform. And I was real interested to find that he was actually called in early on to talk with remote viewers and their different subjects, Ingo Swann, because many of them had early experiences going back to childhood, claiming that they had a UFO connection, and then they have these abilities, these powers, or whatever. And so he was confidentially called in at the time, and he said to look into that. And so anyway, he and Jeffrey Mishlove and many other people who have great reputations claim that they have seen things like Uri Geller actually bend metal, and I even spoke with a naval scientist, did an interview with him, who claimed that he had seen Geller do things that were impossible by the standard rule of physics. And one time he said he was in England, and they were eating at some outdoor cafe, and one of the people in the staff recognized him and brought some of the cooks and other waiters out to see him. And Geller was asked, "Can you bend something for us? What do you expect?" And so somebody went in and got this knife, and this scientist said, "I watched him, and he just held it there and put his hands above it, didn't touch it, and he said, I watched it slowly bend." And he says, "Uri, if you could do that, say on international television with somebody impeccable like Billy Graham, and do this, you'd convince the whole world that this was real, and you'd have the backing of somebody that they'd, most everybody would respect." And he says, no, says, "You don't understand." Say, I don't want to be that visible. He says, there are forces, people out there that, my life wouldn't be worth a plug nickel if everybody believed that I had these powers, these abilities. And I know this Earl Neff, he was a ufologist up in Cleveland, Ohio, who back in the 1950s created a group called the Cleveland Ufology Project.
Okay.
And it's still there. They still have monthly meetings. And I had a little correspondence with him back in 1971, and he was very skeptical of contactee stories and people like Uri Geller at the time. He didn't mention Uri Geller, but I just know that the only contact stories of UFOs that he believed at the time was Betty and Barney Hill, who he'd had on his radio show. And but in 1975, when I was traveling from Maine to California for practically the whole summer, Maine to California, went to California later.
That's quite a long way, yeah.
from Maine to Florida, which was far enough.
That's still far, yeah.
Yeah, and so I went through a lot of different states, and Ohio was one that I really concentrated on. It was a lot stories there. And anyway, I was in touch with regular contact for many years up until his passing. Dr. Berthold Schwartz, who was a psychiatrist and also deep into parapsychology. And he was very interested in the psychic UFO connection. And actually, it was John Keel that brought him into the UFO field because he was just strictly, parapsychology on that part. But in 1968, he wrote an article in a medical journal out of New Jersey, where he lived, that dealt with uh, 4 people that he considered clinically quite sane, and he had interviewed about seeing UFO. And so he wrote this article for the journal. That was going to be his swan song. He wasn't going to do any more. But then Paul Harvey, the famous radio broadcaster up out of, I think, Chicago, got wind of it and wanted more. And John Keel happened to pick up on it, contacted Dr. Schwartz, and they became, good friends. And he introduced Dr. Schwartz to Charles Bowen, the editor then of Flying Saucer Review out of England, where, and other people in the field. And so one thing led to another. Dr. Schwartz began writing articles and going around different states himself, interviewing people, meeting people, and writing up, as a psychiatrist, his view of, what these people, what state of mind they had, and what they had experienced, and not just the UFO, but also any paranormal elements. And there was even Betty Hill that he'd interviewed, and he was famous for Stella Lansing, who constantly reported out of Massachusetts seeing things. He had been with her early on, I think 1967, and they went out somewhere to watch for UFOs. They did see 2 strange lights that he filmed, and then this car from out of nowhere came out from somewhere off to the side. They didn't know it was there. They were on a hilltop, I think, and it started blinking its headlights at this object. And so certainly, since I was introduced to Dr. Schwartz by Ramona Clark, the ufologist experiencer I first mentioned down in Florida, I asked if I could get her contact information, which she did provide. That was one of our first connections. And so I went, me and a friend, and we watched tons and tons of videos. And I've been told by someone that is in the field that area is very active, but always kind of, wondered about some of it. Now, I I was impressed by the fact that she had these images of like luminous hands of a clock. They called it clockwork patterns. And the more I read up on it, they were like they overlapped frames. Um, it looked quite odd. And went home after that very first visit, and an aunt of mine claimed it was either that it was either that morning that we got home late around that time, or maybe the next night that she saw a circle of white lights noiselessly going by her home. She had to get up to go to the bathroom, look out the window, and there it was. This was someone that never reported anything like that, over the years, seeing a UFO. And I thought, wow, what a weird coincidence. But ultimately, as I traveled across the country in '75, I started picking up on my own Super 8mm camera clockwork. Um, and I reported Dr. Schwartz, and he had August Roberts, who was a UFOologist who also worked a lot with cameras and things. And he had never seen anything like it, he said, and he made slides for me of my clockwork images. And ultimately, and this is where we all have to keep digging and questioning, but this part of the experience, I felt that I had definitely solved the clockwork. Not me personally, but I kept hounding Kodak in Rochester, New York, about this. At first, they suggested lens flare. No, it's not lens flare. And then they suggested static electricity. No, no, that's not it. And then finally, one technician said, "What that is it's rivets that we attach one 50-foot reel to another, and it's always at the end of a the film attached to another one." And so at that point, I got one of my reels out, and they were all at the end, and I even put it under a microscope, but what I could plainly see with a lamp was that one side was imprinted. It was actually imprinted into the film. It's not an image, it's an imprint. And then you flip it over and there's nothing. So that's where it was clipped. And Dr. Schwartz even wrote about the clockwork in one of my art. He wrote a series of articles on his investigations for my magazine back in the 90s. And he never mentioned that, he said that Brent and others, Brent Raynes and others, have, when in her presence, got clockwork images too. And he flubbed on that, sadly enough, because it was not that I got these images while in her presence. I'd met her and seen her films, but it was in Ohio and up in Maine that this happened. And even though I explained to him what Kodak had told me, he never, he said, "Well, I know this cinematographer and I know Augie Roberts, and they're quite familiar with photo productions and things, and um, they don't, they really, you know, can't say." And I'm thinking,
It
oh,
reminds
they're
me
not.
that does though this the clockwork thing. So that was just solved and proven to be like a film thing, an actual real world
Yeah, yeah,
scenario.
because the cinematographer and others, maybe that he consulted with, wouldn't necessarily know that. I mean,
Yeah, sure.
the first people but someone that was involved with the development process where they ran it through this development, developing liquid, and had them attached, and running all these people's 50-foot films through this vat for development, and they clipped them together with these rivets. And unfortunately, by the time I found this out, the guy says, "Well, we no longer use those rivets." And that seemed to be what Dr. Schwartz was kind of holding back on. But
And lo and
I
behold, presumably those clockwork images stopped from that point onwards.
yeah, yeah. I got
There
this
you go.
call from Stella. She had heard from Dr. Schwartz that I had been contacted by someone from Kodak, and they made that statement. And she was, as I remember, she was quite upset with me. "But why didn't you consult with me, Brent? I've been dealing with Kodak for years." And I
You
says,
should have
"Well,
rang everyone ever to tell them.
you know, and so I said, "Well, you know, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to check with them myself, and so I got her, calmed down a little, and I asked her, you know, "You getting clockwork now?" "Well, I don't use, you know, I'm not using a Super 8 millimeter, and no, I haven't, but I'm getting other things, and maybe it's the sensitivity of the kind of camera I'm using now or something, And then she called me back after we'd hung up and said that on 35 millimeter footage, a film, she did get a clockwork image. It was a still shot, 35 millimeter, okay, a camera shot. And I said, "Great, can you send it to me?" "Yeah," but I never got it.
Mm.
So that's where it ended. But I know like I said, I told Dr. Schwartz it would seem that when he wrote anything later, he would at least mention that possibility. Never did. Still seemed to, So I learned that even with you know, no matter how educated you are, you can get sucked into these things.
Of
And
course.
and
You look at if you heard of I think his name is Jose Escamilla or Escamida or something like that. Remember when he came out with the rods phenomenon? Do you remember that?
Oh yes, yeah,
Yeah, and that was just proven to be like the shutter speed of video cameras. So there's this whole technology side of things that we can introduce where we think it's something, but it's not. It's just the medium on which we're recording scenarios. So the evidence is not always bang on, is it?
no, I certainly agreed with Dr. Schwartz on the need to study psychic paranormal and people's mental processes and reasoning, and so he was a perfect guy for the job. But when it came to like me, an area, like physics or photography or film, I had to consult with somebody that was their area of specialization to really get you know, a meaningful understanding of the mechanics of the processes involved. I mean, we're not. I remember the late great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung saying that there's too much out there for us one person to know everything, and we have to consult and so I know with myself I have often consulted with people. My co-editor of Alternate Perceptions is someone who's very interested in UFO phenomena, but he's uh, very cautious, and he's a psychologist, and he's written a number of books on UFO paranormal type phenomena, and is aware of all the different elements, and also, like myself, admired John Keel a great deal. Um, you'll excuse me just a moment. I got a little puppy dog that
Yeah,
wants.
you go do
Well,
what you need to do. I'll just mark
oh
this
no,
time.
okay. I decided to get up, and she's wanting me to follow her out. Oh
Animals,
well,
eh?
out the door.
Okay, so I wanna get us onto some of the cases that you personally investigated. So could you just pick what you would deem as one of your favorite cases that you physically went out and spoke to someone, and go through the whole story if you don't mind.
Oh well, there's a lot of different ones that you know. I guess like kind of like with your podcast was my podcast, my Alternate Perceptions magazine, which I started back in '85 when it was of course a print magazine back then. Now it's monthly online, but um, there are so many of them, and I look for um, well, okay. Um, to me, and it's not even in this country. It was in Brazil, and Jacques Vallée touches upon it quite well in his book Confrontations, and and Bob Pratt, who used to work for the National Enquirer, wrote a book about Brazilian cases, UFO Danger Zone, Brazil UFO Danger Zone. I think I got the whole title there,
It's a good
and
title. The
yeah,
Danger Zone, yeah.
yes. Well, it was very thought provoking. Now, I met Bob Pratt in early 1976. He was in Maine investigating reports of UFOs in New England. I met him briefly, and I found out that he was actually a hard-bitten skeptic of UFOs. And it was just the year before, in working with the uh, National Enquirer, they assigned him the UFO desk. And he said that he had worked as an editor of a magazine and a newspaper in Virginia for about 7 years. Each time a UFO report came in, he'd crumble it up and throw it in the wastepaper basket. He didn't. He always figured if you had enough information, you could solve it. And now he was assigned to study these blasted things.
Hmm.
So hey, it's a job. So he said he went out and he investigated a case here in the United States, and there were multiple witnesses. And he says, he kind of had to eat his words. He said this was a good case, and and so I've changed my mind. I got to be kind of a little open minded about this. You know, be cautious, skeptical, discerning, objective, but not just dismiss things out of hand. So anyway, um, for a while he would call me up periodically and just you got anything up in Maine or somewhere in New England we can look into, and uh, and then kind of went our separate ways, and then anyway, I heard he had just come back from Brazil, and this was one of his favorite countries to visit. He would go there 3, 4 weeks at a time. This was his 14th and his last visit to Brazil, and so he it was about a month after he'd come back, and so I interviewed him, and I thought, wow, this is extraordinary. It's high strange. Now he said, now let me preface this by saying that these are um, most of most all of the hundreds, thousands of reports from Brazil. Uh, there's no danger. Person witnesses something, they're startled, whatever, but there's no physical harm. But he said there have been cases where people have been injured, and it looks like they even died after their encounter. They were so traumatic and seemingly sometimes hostile. The beings, the intelligence behind these things. And he said, I don't know why. The Inquirer provided him, to go anywhere, all over the world, many different countries. But Brazil was always his favorite. He went there on the National Enquirer's dime 4 times. But he was so intrigued and invested in studying it that he went 10 times on his own. And so I got to actually meet one of the ladies who was had I think a master's in anthropology and psychology, who lived in Brazil. She was an American, but she lived in Brazil for many, many years in a little community northwest of Rio de Janeiro, little mountain village. And let me pause just a moment here. Come here. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Here's my little buddy here.
Hello. I love a good dog.
Hello. that's Yo-Yo.
Oh, that's a good name. Always back in and out, yeah. In out, in out, yeah.
Yeah. Finally, come. She was whining and wanting up here and next to me, so.
Well, you just have to. That's fine.
Yeah. And we didn't want that whining going on. If people might think something bad's going on here. So anyway, um, this always had intrigued me, and lo and behold, in December of December of 2005, I got to go, thanks to my friend Greg Little, to a UFO, be part of a UFO conference in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I was going to be doing my own presentation, and Jacques Vallée was also going to be there doing a presentation, who had been to Brazil. And not only that, but this lady from Brazil, who was actually Bob Pratt had used as a translator. She could speak Portuguese, and so she was going to be there, and so I got to meet her. Bob Pratt was supposed to be there, but of all things, he passed away about 2 weeks before that conference. But in addition, there was a Brenda Yachoa Slater, who was I was introduced to at that conference. And the stories I heard and interviewed all these people, and they seemed very credible to me, was extraordinary. And there was, first, where do you begin? But okay. It was this girl she's married an American, and she speaks multiple languages. The Navy actually used her for teaching, language to different and translations. And so anyway, Denise Chora Slater, her grandfather was very famous in Brazil. He was a general, and he was also studying parapsychology, and also in around 1968, around out on the outskirts of Brasilia, there was a UFO wave, and he and his son, I think he was like a lieutenant at the time. He's now a general himself, which is of course Denise's father. Had this. They would go out and like on weekends, and they would watch for these UFOs, and they actually saw them. And um, so anyway, Bob Pratt had interviewed him, and I've actually on was given digital copies of the interviews where he speaks in English. General Uchoa speaks in English to Bob Pratt about his experiences, and I got to post those where people can go to Alternate Perceptions and hear those. I'd have to look up the exact month, but
That's
I've
okay.
also
I'm sure they can search it, can't they, via your site? So
right, or they can notify me by email, but and I'll look it up. But yeah, I've interviewed Jacques Vallée. I've interviewed Bob Pratt. I've interviewed Cynthia Newby Luce, who is got the woman who translated. Went with you know Bob Pratt to various places to interview people, and I've interviewed Denise, who has two daughters. She said that she was delighted to get have these audios um, that were provided by Bob Pratt to her before he passed, because this was her grandfather and she had many memories. And he's speaking English, and she said she'd always heard him speak in Portuguese. And of course, and then she told her daughter, says, now you can hear, your grandfather speaking in English,
Hmm.
and but
So what happened
anyway,
then? What supposedly happened?
okay, so that's the ground rules. Extraordinary. I mean, here you've got all these credible investigators down there, and they're investigating this stuff. And uh, with Yuchura, eventually he's confronted by a being, and he has mental contact. It seems, but he cautions his granddaughter Denise. You know, um, you've got to be careful. There's good ones and there's bad ones, and so she had several experiences with the UFOs. Um, and one she experienced kind of a paralysis, and people were concerned about it, but she says I was clearly conscious. I was, it kind of bothered me that people were making a fuss, but over me, because I just kind of uh, you know was paralyzed temporarily. But she says that this large craft had flown over them, and it somehow affected her mobility. She claimed that when she was very, very young, she wanted to, the family would go out and apparently call down the UFOs at this farm they had on the outskirts of, I think it was a place called Alexandria outside of Brasilia, the capital. And so she came up with a plan. She said to pretend that she had fallen asleep in the back of the station wagon, and she had her little Mickey Mouse clock, and it was set for a certain time. And when it was time that she knew they were there, she would pop up and see what was going on. And so she says that she told me, she said I was there, and in the back, and pretending I was asleep. They said, "Oh, just leave her alone. She's sound asleep. It'll be okay." And she popped up when she felt the time was right, and she said all of a sudden she's watching these people standing in a circle holding hands, and there are all these different craft flying around, and her mouth just dropped open in total surprise. And then they realized, uh-oh, she's awake. And so yeah, they went over to her, the grandfather and the grandmother, and he told her, said, you're not old enough really to be in the presence of these things yourself at this time, but just stay with us. And it's too late to turn back now, but when you're older, then you can do this sort of thing. So she says later, when she was old enough, she she was at a university that her grandfather had founded, and she had a class on UFOs, and he would come sometimes and speak. And then one time they went on a field trip, and he apparently was in communication with one that appeared. But the one that came up when we were at this conference in 2005 was one that was uh, really needed investigating. It was they had this young girl who came and worked in their home, and they even helped her with her education. She came from a poor family, and she would help, cook and clean and things like that. And they provided her a room, and they loved her dearly. And but she came down with a life-threatening illness, Chagras. This poor people that living in clay homes in Brazil. Um, there's a problem where these beetle bugs come out, they bite you, and then it causes fluid around your heart to, eventually it gets so much that it kills you.
Sounds
And
delightful. Yeah.
yes,
Isn't nature
absolutely.
wonderful? Yeah.
So she got worse and worse, and eventually she's in a hospital, and she's only got a few days to live. And at this point, um, General Uchua communicates to them mentally that if I've seen you do marvelous things uh, that we can't do. If this, if you, I believe that you could do something to help here, and if you don't, if you let her die, then I will no longer cooperate with you, because supposedly they were the good guys, that he
Mm.
was in touch with. So they agreed, and they told him where to bring her. He went, signed her out of the hospital, and took her to a certain spot and had a little wooden stool, told her to sit there. Everything was going to be all right. You're going to see a bright light. I'll be standing a little distance away, but this is the agreement we had. You're going to be fine. And so a craft came down, and a being came out with some kind of like a syringe, glowing syringe. I think it was kind of bluish, and gave her this injection. And um, I got this story from Denise herself, but she and I've got an article on this too, where I have a picture of Denise and um, Cynthia Newby-Luce, the American who was doing anthropological studies and things and such in Brazil, and working with um, Bob Pratt to help him, understand what people were saying because she knew the language. Um, so I got a picture of them and this woman together in Brasilia, um, deciding to, working on investigating the whole story. And um, Denise's father, who is now a general, went to the hospital and got all the records of it as well. And they've also spoken about this case, which is online, a video of it, uh, for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, out of Los Angeles. So that's online. Um, and so it's quite fascinating. They have the records, Portuguese, of course. But and then another thing that Bob Pratt and Denise said that Bob, you've investigated all these people where people were seriously injured and such, but there's a case of healing. So this was the case. But the one that really caught Jacques Vallée's attention as well as Bob Pratt, and they both investigated independently on their own, was the island of Caleres at the mouth of the Amazon, where there was a massive wave all in that region. But on this island, um, which they had one woman medical doctor, um, people were reporting left and right being hit by these beams and having like burns on their chest area. And the locals associate with supernatural being, part of their tradition called the chupa or the chupa chupa, that would was like a vampire type thing. And all these people, they had like burns on their chest, burning like a sunburn, but also there would be like 2 points that had like kind of bloody,
Like a
like
vampire
fangs,
would. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, like vampire. And in fact, there was a picture of one woman showing this thing. Um, so they ended up with, I guess, about 40 people, at least 3 dozen, who came in with these symptoms, and it would last for about a week, and then they would recover. Except in two instances where one person had a heart attack and another person died. And but the doctor herself thought at first that these were just reactions to superstitious people, and they were seeing what they wanted to see. But then it kept on, and she started noticing these, the symptoms were very odd. They had elevated white blood cell counts, and they developed a little fever, and they had these marks on their body. And she began to get concerned. And the Brazilian military came in, and um, they had cameras. They took motion picture footage. They took still pictures, and there was the press that was drawn into it. They were also on the island taking lots of pictures. And according to Valley, some American firm came in and bought all the negatives from the newspapers, saying that, well, someone in America has good evidence that these things really were there. And the doctor herself said one day she came out of the clinic, and there was this large cylindrical object in the sky just above the main street. And she walked down the street following it as it slowly moved along, very low elevation. And I think she watched it for somewhere close to about 10 minutes. In all these instances, these beams would come and strike the people um, from a craft. But in one instance that Bob Pratt had interviewed, this woman who claimed that it was like a man in a diving suit. And he had like some sort of like a thing she associated like a gun, because this beam came out of it and struck her in the chest. And, she showed him the wound that she had, which was typical of all the others. And that was like early in 1978. So it started in 77 and continued on for several months. And, I've tried to find out more who the American firm was. And all Valley said was that he spent a day on a Brazilian Air Force base. And, there he heard things, learned things that, kind of kept confidential, I guess, that just talking among themselves. Uh, but I think that's probably where he came up with that information about the American firm.
Mm.
Uh, but
It's a strange case, the Colares case, and it's obviously very disconcerting, especially when you lay it alongside the healing case that you've mentioned.
yes, and that's another, you have these reports, but I mean, I know I had talked with another investigator in Brazil who lived in Brasilia. He was an engineer, a teacher, and of course Cynthia Newby Luce, and they had all, along with Bob Pratt, investigated a number of other cases. And one of them that I thought was really pretty wild was a gentleman lived out in the country, uh, and this was kind of typical of a number of cases. And it's like, what the hell, if you'll excuse me, is going on here? Only Brazil, but um, some guy that had been like entangled in these like chains or whatever, and was being pulled up right next to his house one night, up into this craft above it, and there was like an opening in the bottom of it, and it was pulling him up, you know. And as I recall, there was a woman inside, like a woman type person, and talking about, we got to find specimen here, earthling. And anyway, meanwhile, his his wife's brother in the house. He opens a window. He had these wooden slats. And he just opens them up. He hears you know, he hears him yelling. He's screaming, and he's being hauled up and grabbed. And he gets to the bottom of it, and he's kicking the sides, trying to prevent from get loose. And he does. He manages at one point to suddenly he's released from these chains or whatever, and he falls, I think 25 or 30 feet, but luckily he's in a bush, and that saved him. The bush though had thorns, and you he
So
was
that
pretty
didn't, yeah.
he was pretty messed up, and the investigators got to see right afterwards that arrived there that his injuries, um, and there's a lot of stories that Bob Pratt had of hostile behavior of you know between the experiencer and the UFO activity. Um, but
Excuse me.
oh,
Sneeze there.
bless you, bless you. So to me, that was even though I wasn't there in Brazil, I was in Brazil in the Navy briefly in Recife, but I never was at those parts investigating those. But I got to talk with and meet the people who were principal in it, and uh, so to me that was pretty spectacular, and cases like Ted Owens, although I thought he was just you know I thought that was probably a case that would go nowhere, and I was wrong. um, Dorothy Isaac up in Canada, who was investigated by many. Peter Surgelis, however you pronounce his last name, wrote a book, Being of Light, and she would grab a camera, and these UFOs would appear to her, and she considered them beings of light, angel-like. It was a positive experience for her. Years later, I not too long ago contacted. I see the family um, is now, she's passed on, but has all these pictures and things that she wrote, and so they have on Facebook a page dedicated to their mother. And one of the daughters told me that she had seen an alien one time, and quite by surprise, this hooded figure with like a robe, and it was in the greenhouse where she was working at the time, and was just walking along, and she thought, "Who is this?" And um, turned around, very strange experience, and she went and told her mother, and she said, "Oh, you saw one of the," I think she said, "the grays," you know. But there's a picture of her and Dr. J. Allen Hynek, of course, the man who worked with the Air Force for many years, Project Blue Book and all,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually came out and says, I think there really is something to this, although he used to be the Air Force's astronomer go-to guy to dismiss UFOs, because he could explain many of them. But anyway, of course, after the Air Force disbanded back in December 69, after, the University of Colorado said it was all just, nothing to it really. The Air Force doesn't need to be involved in this anymore. They did a 2-year study where they essentially just duplicated a lot of the Air Force's earlier records, and so there's no threat to national security and so on and so forth, and so that's what the Air Force wanted to, to be relieved of the responsibility. I think there was, even more to that. There was this Miss Cateau who worked for the Library of Congress. And interestingly, John Keel around that time was working, I think 69, 70, with the Library of Congress. And he came, I found out when I was working on my book on John Keel, that he and Miss Cateau became good friends. And I didn't know it until Tim Beckley in the UFO field was said he was doing a talk in Ohio, and in came Miskito and John Keel and sat down together. And so then I contacted John Keel's good friend, excuse me, uh, Doug Skinner, who maintains the johnkeel.com website with many of Keel's, copies of articles, correspondence, and things, even some with Miskito. And he confirmed that they had a good, strong friendship, and has even posted letters that they used to exchange. And she had written a 400-page volume on all sorts of the literature on UFOs through the years. And the Air Force wanted it to send it to the Condon Committee, and essentially, I'm sure, to show that this doesn't belong in our province. This is not something we should be involved with because, as she stated, a lot of this UFO literature dealt with paranormal effects, even demonology, um, uh, ghostly type phenomena, and so on. And it was interesting because in John Keel's one of his first book, Operation Trojan Horse, in 1970, he devotes 2 paragraphs to her, but he doesn't really say there that he knew her and how involved he was in the situation, because in the Mothman prophecies, there was a section where a woman from Washington went to see Ivan Sanderson to go through his UFO newspaper clippings on UFOs, and she ends up being followed by a truck that has some company name, and the guy, pulls over when she stops at some place to get gas, and he says, "Ma'am, I think there's something wrong with your car or something." He crawls up on her car despite her protesting. Everything's fine, and after a brief while, he comes out and says, "Oh, nope, I'm mistaken. Everything's fine." But he'd been following her, and she was kind of getting concerned since they left the main highway, wondering about him. And anyway, she eventually arrives at Ivan Sanderson's, tells him the story. They call John Keel, explain to him what's happening. Um, and so, okay, so Ivan Sanderson goes under the vehicle and finds that there's some spots of putty, like it held something under there or something. Or Keel thought maybe, having been in the army, that maybe there was some explosives or something. So, call the police. So they called the police, and they took down the information, and she said what was on the back of this truck, associated with a certain company, furniture company or something, and they checked, and there was no such company in New Jersey. So who was this guy? And of course, Keel often felt that his phone was being tampered with and such, and all kind of. So was this?
That's a whole big can of worms, isn't it? How
Yeah,
shadow organizations might play into this whole paranormal sphere.
yeah.
But
So
you touched on Mothman. Let's talk about Mothman actually. What was
yeah.
the story of it? What was the genesis of how Mothman got his name? What was it?
Oh, okay. The mom, they originally called it the bird,
Okay.
and witnesses, it was the bird, and when it got into the newspaper started writing about it, one of the writers, since Batman was a popular TV show, decided to be creative, and he called it the Mothman. You know,
Just randomly. Okay.
yeah, yeah. And so that's where it stuck. And of course, Keel wrote the book in 1975, The Mothman Prophecies, um, and that's how that instead of just the bird. But there were people who tried to say, well, these witnesses are just seeing sandhill crane, or they're just seeing a barn owl. But the witnesses, totally disagreed.
Can you give
They
me an
all said,
example of what one of the witnesses actually said they saw? Presumably size-wise is huge.
Yeah, usually about 6 or 7 feet tall, had either glowing red or maybe car headlights struck the eyes and they were red. Um, the you know um, Linda and Roger Scarberry were young couples at the time, and they were in the this area called the TNT plant back in World War II. Was ammunition manufacturing, and they stored a lot of ammunition in these domes. They were scattered all over this property, concrete domes that had this ammunition in, and um, and there was another couple in there with them, and they all witnessed this flying creature with these red eyes. And Roger Scarberry was he. They got in the car and he headed back toward Point Pleasant. They went to the police, claiming that this thing was following, even though they're going at high speed. Um, this thing was right over the car at one point, and they could see a wing on one side and a wing on the other flapping.
Lovely.
And so that was the start. But other people claimed to have seen it prior to that, but it took that dramatic encounter to go to to become a news item, and then other people were claiming they had seen it. Um, I went with a Ron Schaffner out of the Cincinnati area of Ohio, along with two other people. Ron Schaffner had a publication called Creature Chronicles. He was very interested in John Keel's findings and also cryptids in general, particularly Bigfoot.
Hmm.
But Mothman was certainly an intriguing cryptid. So I went with him back in May of 1976 and tried to network as much as possible. Did meet Linda Scarberry and her mother and father at their home, along with some other family members. And again with the Mothman and there's the UFOs and Mabel McDaniel, her mother claimed that she had seen a flying figure. But you know, whatever these things were, Keel claimed that there were a couple of witnesses who claimed that the flying being had gone over their heads and they heard like a mechanical sound.
Mm.
And and I got to talk with a Miss Thomas who lived right there with her husband worked around the TNT complex. And the key this story is in the Mothman prophecies, as well as Strange Creatures from Time and Space that came out in 1970. But anyway, um, it was in November 2nd, 1967, and she told me that she remembered there was looked like a storm was about to, the clouds were dark, and she felt like she needed to go outside and cover up some motorcycles. And that's when she noticed across the road in a field was this tall, dark figure. Now she says, I never saw any wings, but this was in the daytime. Said all of a sudden it just flew like lightning. I mean, it ran like lightning, I should say, not flew, across this field. And as it did, it made a sound like a broken fan bell. And her ears started crackling, popping sound. And she said she couldn't take her eyes off this. She said it was like I was in a trance. And she said that experience convinced me that I was looking at a robot, a fast moving robot. And she was also one of the people that had claimed that she uh, had a dream about a disaster on the Ohio River. And of course, from reading like Mothman prophecies that was part of, a number of people felt something ominous was going to
Ominous.
happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Even Mary Heyer, who used to help Keel a lot to connect with people and witnesses, um, claimed that she had had a dream of a disaster on the Ohio with Christmas packages floating in the river, but didn't know just exactly, you know, what happened. It was just, there was something bad. And this woman told me that she had had prophetic dreams, you know, apparently throughout her life. She even recalled for me, this Miss Thomas, about seeing. having a dream about a fire at a jail cell, and there she said later there was one there in Point Pleasant, which several people died. And so anyway, um, I was surprised when meeting Linda Skyberry that she started telling about seeing a figure with red eyes at the old uh, brick building there, power plant there, I guess that used to be there at the TNT area until they tore it down, standing in a doorway. And then she told me about she in Point Pleasant. She lived for a while in an apartment. She was upstairs, and through the window there was Mothman, and it had those glowing red eyes, and she was just like inches away. It was on the other side of the glass, and she says, I'm always scared when I see it, but she says I want to see it, but then when I do have the encounter, she says I kind of freak out. Of course, the first encounter she was hospitalized and had very traumatic reaction. She was in shock. Um, but so this is so anyway. She said, I said, how many encounters have you had? And she said hundreds. And I thought, well, man, I hadn't heard that in Keel's writings. Whoops, sorry about that. So
That's okay.
so yeah. So anyway, when I wrote the Keel book, because I'd been so influenced by his journey, and he influenced my journey, where I wanted to get out in the field and roam around and see what kind of stories people would tell and share. So I eventually got to write a Hankum Blankovic, who archives of the unexplained over in Sweden. And he told me that he had a fellow researcher named Aki Fresen who came to the U.S., who helped Keel with some material from, to write for his book, Operation Trojan Horse, of cases in Sweden. And so then this this guy wanted to come to the United States. He said, if it's a hoax, well, I'll at least have a good vacation. So he saved up for about 6 months, some money, and he met Keel, got a letter of introduction uh, that opened a lot of doors. He said in West Virginia. He spent the first time in October 1969. He spent about 4 weeks, and then he came back later the following year. And anyway, he even got very close to Linda Skyberry in a kind of romantic way. He was even going to try to maybe move to the United States and get a job in the Point Pleasant area, but things just didn't work out there. But anyway, the big thing here, relevant thing, is that he met about 30 witnesses to Mothman while he was there. And so this was early on, and he even recalled one couple telling a story of how they were in that old power plant, and this woman said that she had found this Mothman crouched down in a small room, and she screamed and was, very frightened. And John Keel, he said, was there at that time when it happened. And the husband, you know, assumed that she was just letting her imagination run away with her. And then as they were leaving, they were crossing a field, and suddenly there was the creature right in front of them. He could see it himself. And something that Linda Scarberry told me that these things did. According to this Aki Fresen, he was told that this creature did too. It put its wings out, what we assume were wings, to the side, straight out, and then just took off like a rocket into the air. Didn't flap its wings. It just put them out, stretched off to the sides, and then shot out.
Well, what does that suggest? That suggests some sort of technology, doesn't it, rather than
Well,
an
yeah, it
animal?
does. it does suggest that, and you have the thing with the mechanical sounds and whatnot, but still, it's like, what the heck? And there
Is
were the
that what all the
UFO.
witnesses pointed to? I mean, was there a common thread that said it could be a robot, or was there all a different
Well, no,
scenario?
that was just with some of them that felt that, a lot of them didn't know what it was. Um, there was, according to Acufresden, it was the eyes, or what they assumed were the eyes, that were the most disturbing to the witnesses. They almost had like a hypnotic effect. And I know um, Keel even wrote that there was some man who went out on his front porch one night and saw this creature on his front lawn, and suddenly it was like he was hypnotized and he couldn't move for about 20 minutes. Then he finally was able to break away and went into the house, and his wife says, "My God," says, "you're pale. You look like you just saw a ghost." He's like, "I don't know what I saw, but it was on the front lawn." Um, but
There's
then there
stories
was,
of the greys, aren't there? They're very similar to that, where people say they can't break their gaze
yeah,
with a grey.
yeah,
So it almost then lends credence to that. Maybe this Mothman was some sort of extraterrestrial, potentially.
yeah. There was another person that I got to interview uh, for my book, and he'd always been on my radar, but I didn't know where he was. And that, he mentions, and Keel mentions several times in Mothman Prophecies of Dan Drazen, or Drazen, or how to pronounce it. I know he corrected me. Says everybody gets it wrong the first time. But I've got a video interview that I did with him that's a couple of years ago, and it's on YouTube. And anyway, of course, a number of people have interviewed him now. But at the time, I came across a video of a Dan Drazen over in the Netherlands with a guy who was like a psychic medium who could produce images of the dead on film. And so there was this Dan Drazen, who is a professional photographer guy, and he's doing a situation, just him and this psychic guy in the room, under controlled circumstances. He's controlling everything himself. Dan is, and I'm thinking, my goodness, is this the same guy? And so I reach out to Nancy Talbert, who is this lady who's studying crop circles in the U.S. and abroad, um, and who had also been over there in the Netherlands and worked with this young man who claimed to have psychic abilities, and even was at his home when she saw shafts of light come down, and suddenly there was crop circle where there hadn't been one. But yeah, so I says, "Is this the guy from the Mothman Prophecies, New John Keel?" And she says, "I don't know, but here's his address." Well, come and find out, he's now living out he did live in New York. He's now living in San Francisco, California. And yeah, he was the guy. And the story again evolved even stranger, more complex. He went down there about 4 times with John Keel in '67. Even brought a science editor from a PBS affiliate there in New York. He was, to meet the witnesses and see what was going on. He proposed that they do a documentary, and if they provide the financial support, he would go ahead and be willing to, because he was a documentary producer, young but starting out in the field. He would like to be involved and do the filming for him if they. So they seem very positive and upbeat, but apparently some of the people that were provided the financing decided this was just too weird or whatever, and it didn't happen. But just imagine what we could have had. But he said he went down there and he met Linda Scarberry and a number of the Mothman witnesses, and he'd even seen some strange things himself. One of which is in chapter 10 of the Mothman Prophecies, where he and Mary Hyre and John Keel were, I think, on a hilltop watching a UFO in the daytime, it looked like. And it was this one cloud that Dan Dresden says it looks like it's out of a children's movie. This one little cloud in a blue sky, kind of like Mary Poppins or something. And this UFO, I kicked this table in, uh, is, is, uh, is coming along and it goes into the cloud. And then they're waiting, to see it's going to come out the other side. When it comes out the other side, instead of being this UFO, it was a uh, a prop plane flying along, and they're all like just scratching their heads. What the heck, And because they were sure that we're seeing a UFO here. And Keel talked um, about UFOs that can mimic airplanes at times and maybe shapeshift, so to speak. Um, I got a friend over in New Jersey, Peter Jordan, who used to visit John Keel and talk with him, and we were talking about this recently and how Keel was kind of talking about cases like that. But the strangest thing with him and his experience with John Keel was, let's see, it was there was he had been to West Virginia too and been told that there was going to be a disaster on the Ohio. They didn't know what it was. Um, the way he remembers it, December 15th, 1967, there was one of the people in West Virginia did say that there was going to be a disaster at that time on the Ohio River. I question it because the way John Keel wrote it up, there was going to be a disaster on how there was no date, but there was supposed to be a big power blackout when the president lit up the Christmas tree, on December 15th of '67. And instead, what happened over the TV came this story about a bridge just collapsed in the Ohio River in between West Virginia and Ohio. And of course, later you find out in the way Keel wrote it up, it turned out it was the Silver Bridge crossing to the Ohio side of the Ohio River from Point Pleasant. 46 people perished. What's not in the book, and Dan Dresden sent me the letter Keel wrote to him later, saying that in the letter, he later was in a department store in New York City, and there was this guy, Joe's wife, and he says, "Oh, how's Joe doing?" And she says, "Oh, John, he passed away." Now, what you got to understand is that, and Dan was there when he, was in the apartment. The guy showed up at his door, at his door, Keel's door, on December 15th, 1967, and they talked. It was him. He hadn't seen him for a few years, but said it was him. He was his best man at his wedding in 1950. They had all of his memories and everything. Everything seemed normal. They even went out to have lunch, him and this friend of his named Joe, and went to a UFO talk that Jim Moseley was sponsoring, a well-known figure in the UFO field. And so everything seemed normal on that end until sometime later uh, that Keel meets the wife. And she says he died. He had a heart attack. And he says, "Oh, no, when?" And she says, "July 1965. And Keel responds more or less, "That can't be. I just met him back in December of '67, over 2 years later. You must be mistaken about the date." She says, "John, I was there for the entire ordeal. I know what I'm talking about."
Mm.
And so I've asked Doug Skinner. I says, "You knew Keel real well. How about, this story?" And he said, "Well, we talked some about UFOs, but we also, had other interests too. And that never came up, But I have interviewed a couple of brothers who big John Keel fans that met him and spent hours with him in 2003 when Keel was there at the unveiling of the Mothman statue there. And they have that annual now every September gathering Mothman Festival. And so he told them the exact same story that Dan Dresden told me, except he never revealed who the person was. But otherwise, all of it fit together. And they said that one of them said, "Well, Keel, that must have been a really interesting experience." And he says, "It's caused me a lot of sleepless nights." So that's all we know. But and he sent me Dan Dresden sent me the letter that Keel had written to him about it later. And he says, yeah, he was he could describe him. He described him in the interview to me, a big, tall guy with a strong handshake, and he was Keel's friend. That's all I could tell you. But
It's
then
a
the
weird
bridge
one. What
collapsed.
is that? Is that either it's a ghostly phenomenon or it is somebody just playing the part?
Yeah,
What was it put down to?
and all, and yeah, I mentioned that to one researcher. He says, well, Jim Moseley and Gray Barker were notorious tricksters, you know,
There you go.
but this guy played his part so well. They were together for several hours, went out to eat, went to this, you know, Keel took him to hear this Jim Moseley's UFO conference. And, you know, um, to Dan Dresden, who has produced a documentary called Calling Earth since then, um, which deals with him going around interviewing people who've had apparent voices of the dead of family members or people they knew, or EVPs, or their images coming over televisions and such. Or that's why he was interested in going to the Netherlands to interview that psychic medium. So yeah, where do and he said there are a lot of accounts where old friends have appeared to people and appear to be physically real. I've been told some stories like that myself. But certainly you got to look at both sides of the coin and wonder what the heck,
Exactly.
Uh,
And I'm also got wondering what the heck with Mothman. So, did it end all the visitations of Mothman with that bridge collapse, or has it
oh,
continued to this day?
oh, it's certainly the activity lost its momentum. A lot of people thought it ended, but it really hadn't. People occasionally still have experiences. I've met a couple who the husband was practically dragged to Point Pleasant. The wife wanted to go because she has a lot of psychic sensitivity, and he does too. But he just thought the Mothman that didn't sound that interesting to him. But they went to the town and they got directions to go to the old TNT area. And when they went up there, they spent a little time, and then they just felt like they were was something there, a presence, or they were being watched, and kind of disturbed them. So they decided to head back to Point Pleasant and meet this storekeeper that they had met there. And on the way, they said they saw this tall, dark figure going from one side of the road to the other, almost like it was just leaping or floating or whatever. They both saw it. And when they got into Point Pleasant, they told this guy about it. And eventually, other people who were investigating, cases like this, decided, well, we need to um, go back and with you and reconstruct this event. And it turned out that when they were coming down the road, they remembered a certain gas station, and from one end of the gas station to the other, they had these different colored flags that went up and over the station down to the other side. When they went back there, it wasn't there. And some other features where there was a cornfield there wasn't. They vividly remembered that. And so they, and plus they had, it took them longer to get back to Point Pleasant than it should have. This, you know, so they were wrestling with what exactly was this experience. At first, it was just the figure that they saw going across the road in the daytime. And then, it became, how come we misremembered all the details and why did it take us so long to get back?
Yeah, some
So,
sort of time slip or abduction or both.
or yeah, whatever label you want to slap on there,
Mm.
it was peculiar to them. So, yeah, so I've corresponded with him and even met him at the Mothman gathering there in September of uh, yeah 2019. I was up there. I actually spoke. Uh, I had my book that just came out that year, so I was promoting it, and we had already been in touch. So we met there and had some conversation and got a picture with him with Joy Medea, and yeah, and they were good friends with Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who's well known in the 14 field, and she also was very involved in working when I was putting my book together, proofreading it, and also had suggested certain people I should reach out to, and also included my interviews. And she wrote the forward to the book, and I also had an interview in the book with her. And she claimed that she'd seen these dark shadow figures in the TNT area when she'd gone there. And she had an EVP at the site where the bridge collapsed that to her sounded a lot like John Keel. So anyway,
Interesting.
uh,
What was the conclusion of this whole scenario? What was it put down to be? Just like a some sort of portent of something to come, or was it, what's the theory, the main theory?
well, a lot of people have uh, thought that maybe it was maybe a warning related to the Mothman. Rosemary Guiley actually thought that maybe it was a kind of a form of the jinn. She was kind of interested in the idea that maybe these things were the jinn. Like I dream of Jeannie, but nothing like Barbara Eden. Uh,
No, not at all.
and other researchers, including Gordon Crichton, who was the last editor of Flying Saucer Review in England, also kind of thought that the jinn was an interesting idea because they could appear, disappear, they could be shapeshifters, they could take different forms, um, and so a number of ufologists had considered the jinn thing that they could be interdimensional, whatever, come and go. Uh,
A visitor from a hidden realm, you'd say, wouldn't you?
yes, yes, yes. In fact, that Hidden Realm was a nice touch. My first book in 2004 was Visitors from Hidden Realms because I didn't know I didn't want to go the ET route because I wasn't really sure that that's all it was cracked up to be.
Hmm.
But it certainly involves from the reports and the people. There's some various consciousness, psychical elements that arise, and I just spoke at the Eureka Springs UFO conference in the Ozarks of Arkansas, and that's an event that happens uh, been happening annually since 1988. And one of its main speakers is Forrest Crawford, who's been in the field for many years, worked with the Mutual UFO Network, helped them with taking a lot of their files and digitalizing them so they could be available on the internet, and has been a regular feature, master of ceremonies quite often, and was master of ceremonies this time around. And first night I got there, he sat down at the table I was at, said, I understand we have a mutual friend. And this was a lady in Alabama that I know quite well who was a MUFON state director for years. And anyway, he started telling me about seeing classic flying saucer back in 1967 when he was just 10 years old. And I said, oh, well, that's why you're in this field now. That drew you in.
Hmm.
And I arranged maybe interviewing later, which I just interviewed, which the interview is on my YouTube channel, and I got a link to it in the current issue, the May issue of Alternate Perceptions.
There's a link to your channel in the description to this video as well, by the way.
Yes, there's a link. Well, I don't
I'm
know.
linking one for you in the description to
Okay.
this video. So,
Oh, okay, great. I appreciate that. Anyway, as you know, he has, as an investigator, working with Mutual UFO Network, he became involved and working. His appearances at this conference became um, involved in some extraordinary cases, and so that's in there. And they talk about high strange, where there was a guy from Brazil, wouldn't you know it? He met who approached Lucius Farge, who early on was one of the lead people who was organizing this conference, this annual conference, and Lucius Farge directed this Brazilian guy to talk with him and another fellow investigator, and so they anyway, the short and sweet of it, the very abbreviated version, and I did like 40-something minute interview with him, and he says the whole story would take about good 2 hours to really cover thoroughly. But what he told me was that he was with this guy and some other investigators, and the guy started channeling this intelligence from the UFOs, and uh, all of a sudden, over his face, because he was looking at him, and this other woman was looking at him face on, and there was this greenish image just over covering his face, and suddenly you could see his face, but then there was like other people's faces that were appearing. He says they were so vivid, if I saw them on the street, even today, I would recognize them. But they would say there was like 6 or 7 of these images. 2 of them were women, and the others were men. And they would be there a few seconds, and then it'd be gone. Then another one, then another one. And he claimed they were from a UFO. The UFO beings that were channeling this information. And so, he looked around to see if he could figure out where this might be coming from, because so you got to be skeptical, and said that they later he finds out that someone was sitting on the sidelines, to the side of this individual, only saw in front of his face about an inch this greenish thing, but he wasn't seeing it head on like they were, where face on, where they could see the figures. I only saw that there was this light that was over the face. Because I was saying, was it a beam coming from the ceiling or the floor? No, it was just right in front of his face, whatever this was.
hmm.
And then afterwards, someone said, could we see a UFO? And he says, yeah, there's one outside there now. So they go out and they look up, and he says, like the 3 stars of Orion's belt, but there was another one very bright. And they're all looking at it and say, well, that's pretty obvious. That's not one of the stars of Orion's belt. And he said all of a sudden after they all got a good look at it, it just took off. And later he's investigating another case, a guy in Missouri, and they said he would go up every 3 months to visit this guy. And every time he went, he said, there was always something strange happen, a UFO or something else. But one that he had told John Mack about, which is in John Mack's book at the back, he mentions this, in Abductions, is the fact that this guy, they were sitting at a picnic table at his home, lives out in a rural area, and there's a light that comes up over the trees. And it's very weird. And it's bright blue, the forest. The other guy sees it too, the other investigator with him, and they're very amazed. But then when they go home, he says we're in the car together driving back home, and this guy is we're both really quiet. Then I say, man, that was really strange, that blue light. The other guy says, what blue light? He says, that UFO. I didn't see no blue light. Well, what did you see? He said, I saw this big silvery craft. He saw something completely different. And they couldn't understand why one would see this bright blue light, the other would see this craft. And that was what, you know, uh, John Mack, the psychiatrist from Harvard who wrote that book, Abduction, was so amazed by. And he pointed out that sometimes these things happen. That how do you explain that? That someone sees things so different. And plus, on one occasion, and it's also in the interview, uh, these two guys, there was no link showing that they ever knew each other. One guy from Brazil, the other guy who used to be in the military and lives out in the wilds of Missouri. And anyway, he went into a trance, and the same thing happened again. Over his face were images of different people, clear images, and they said it was just like the other guy from Brazil. And you know, they weren't the same faces, but it was the same phenomena.
The phenomena is truly strange, I think, in every aspect from subjective viewings, i.e., me and you could see different things,
Mm-hmm.
and then obviously the technology of the UFOs projecting onto people's faces. It's just all weird. And speaking of weird, we are now entering the Koit zone. Koit zone! Brent, in the Koit zone, I'm going to ask you random quick-fire questions. Answer best you can. They could be silly questions, they
That's all I
could be
can
real
do.
questions. Okay, so what is your favourite candy item?
My favorite candy item.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm really not a big candy person, but every once in a while, a good lollipop, like Telly Savalas. you
Oh
know?
yeah, the old packet ones.
Yeah.
Good man. Is there anything that scares you?
Well, when I'm in the dark, I always like to have some light, you know.
No, that's fair. So you don't like the dark.
Yeah.
Fair play. Are there too many humans?
Um, well, I think we have to be careful because, we do impact possible effects of climate change and such with over 7 billion inhabitants of the planet. You know, I think, you know, I think we need to be just real careful of how we affect the environment. I don't want to say we need to off a bunch of people,
That's what you're thinking, though, isn't it? I know you're thinking it.
No, 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 no.
You've got
Just
plans on your desk.
can you see that? No.
Yeah, I can. There's a mirror just behind you there.
Oh
Um,
my gosh. Be careful
is
of that.
speaking of things behind you, is there anything in your house that you're planning on selling soon?
Oh, uh, well, there's a few items. I was just, like I say, I was just at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Festival May 3rd, covering from that experience. uh, and I was supposed to speak on Mothman, of course, but Bigfoot was the big item. And I got a place to sit and greet the public and sell things. Although I sold a few back issues of my magazine when it was print, but not majorly. The most of the line went to next to me the TV's Mountain Monster guys, if you remember them, Wild Bill and so on and company. Um, and every once in a while, someone would come up to me and say, "What's this about?" And I say, "Oh, it's John Keel, Mothman, and oh, what's a Mothman, or what do you think about Mothman?" And I heard some people come up with some interesting stories, which I got their email addresses, so hope to follow up and communicate with them down the road. First, there was the wife who told about she and her husband seeing something and having missing time. Then the husband come up and shared about that. Plus, one time something came flying through the house. Apparently, came through the walls, and uh, and he's got a video that he's been wanting somebody to look at and to say what do they think it is. And so far, he hasn't really found anybody to really give it a fair examination. So I said, well, you can, you know, I asked him maybe he could send it online. He said no, he'd send me a DVD later, but he said he still had a few more weeks on his vacation, so it would be a while. So maybe that'll pan out, maybe not. Then there was one guy up in Kentucky. He said that um, he had never really thought much about this stuff, never seen anything, but he said this one night, whenever it was, um, he said there was this thing looked like two flashlights, it was luminous, but they were spaced like two eyes, and you know, but they were up higher than this 12-foot tree. And he said all of a sudden, it was like it. Here's the eyes like it cocked its head. And he thought, oh, that's a creature, and that's what ran through his mind. And he ran back to the house, and he said hadn't seen it since, but he said I've been warning people about don't let the kids roam back there in the backyard. You never know. And so I want to hear more of that story and maybe any other details that he can add
Well,
to it.
maybe that will come your way via email or DVD when the time arrives. But I'm going to have to push you on this. Is there anything in your house that you're selling soon?
I've just got some extra copies of the MUFON Journal and just a few copies, some copies of alternate perceptions when it was in its going back to the early 90s when it was like a newsletter type thing. Eventually, we got to the point where we were like a 56, 58 page color cover magazine. And but then the doggone internet come by and we had to cancel that. We were losing subscribers. But anyway,
The
but
internet did
yeah,
change a lot, my friend. Yeah, I know.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I
next
enjoy.
question: wet
Okay.
shave or dry shave with an electric?
Oh, I drive shave. Yeah,
Good choice. Yeah, wet shave is quite scary, isn't it, with a blade at your throat?
yeah.
So-
I've done
um.
that in the past.
Oh yeah, never good. Right. Okay. Here's an interesting one. You get to swap into the body of any celebrity, alive or dead, for 24 hours. Who are you choosing and why?
No, I never thought of that one. Uh, that's
I know, because it's random.
it's that one's out there. I don't know if I'd want to be swapping a bit. Just being in my own body is challenging enough sometimes. But man, wow, let's see. Ah, well, I don't know. Maybe just temporarily in William Shatner, see, Mister Captain Kirk himself. I don't know.
That's fair enough. And you could go back to a time when he was actually Captain Kirk filming the show. That would be
Oh
good.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I'd do that as well. Do you have a favourite drink?
Oh well, actually, very common. I drink Coca-Cola quite a bit.
Are you
Gives me a buzz.
full sugar or the non-sugar?
Oh, the sugar, yeah. If you're gonna drink something bad, might as well enjoy it.
Go the whole hog. That's it.
That's it.
Um, last question in the Koit zone for you. What is the last fruit you picked from a tree or a bush?
Okay. Blueberries. Yeah,
Blueberries. Get in. Okay,
yeah.
thank you. That is the end of the Koit zone. I told you they were random questions. And that leads us on to our final question today. What are you currently working on? Is there a project or anything you're working on at the moment?
Well, my online magazine, Alternate Perceptions, is kind of my networking tool a lot of times, and so I want to find out a little more. Follow up with um, the guy I met in Arkansas, Boris Crawford, and hear more of that story. And I'm also I'm in touch right now with a granddaughter of Kenneth Arnold, who,
Okay.
that started it all, the flying saucer
Yes.
era back in 1947, and what she can share. And there's, a lot of things here and there I try to reach out and connect with, but those are the two big ones right now.
Okay, thank you. Right, Brent, thank you ever so much for coming on today. Everyone watching and or listening, check out the links in the descriptions to Brent's site and socials, etc. You go and have a look at his YouTube channel. Thank you, Brent. Thank you ever so much for coming on. Much appreciated.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Cool. Goodbye, everyone. Bye bye. To watch other KoitCast episodes, please click the image top left. To subscribe to my channel, please click the image top right. Please like and share to help KoitCast grow, and most importantly of all, please click the notification bell so you never miss an upload.